You're listening to the Ag Policy Connection, brought to you by Real Agriculture in partnership with the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. We're connecting the dots between the people and the policies that shape agriculture and farming today and into the future.
For anyone involved in grain farming or the grain industry in Western Canada, the winter of 2013-14 stands out as the year of the major rail backlogs as railways struggled and failed in some cases to get grain to market to the port on the West Coast and to fulfill contracts with international buyers of Canadian grain. With no access to water like the St. Lawrence or the Mississippi, grain producers and grain companies in Western Canada depend on railways to get crops to market. And that backlog in 2013-14 triggered and created the pressure to make some legislative and regulatory changes to how railways work in Canada and their relationship with shippers. The Conservatives, Agriculture Minister Jerry Ritz and Transport Minister Lisa Raitt at the time, passed some temporary legislation aimed at addressing the immediate problem, the backlog in the rail system. And then in 2018, we saw the Liberal federal government, Agriculture Minister Lawrence MacAulay and Transport Minister Mark Garneau pass what was dubbed the Transportation Modernization Act. I'm Kelvin Hepner, and on this episode of the Ag Policy Connection, brought to you by the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute and Real Agriculture, we are focusing on grain transportation, those changes that were made to the Transportation Act as a result of the big grain backlog of 2013-14. What led to those changes? What was the lobbying and the political process like? Because there were some very unique political events that occurred between the House of Commons and the Senate. Where have the changes that were made worked as expected, and where have they failed? Big questions today. Our panel for this episode features three different perspectives. First, we're going to have Mark Hemis of Quorum Corp, which runs the federal government's grain monitoring program, providing data and analytics on how the grain transportation system is working. He's done that for many years. Scott Streiner is the former chair and CEO of the Canadian Transportation Agency. He was also an assistant deputy minister at Transport Canada during some of these policy changes. And finally, we have Greg Northey of Pulse Canada, bringing the shipper's perspective. Pulse Canada is also a member of the Ag Transport Coalition, which was formed as a result in many ways of that backlog in 2013-14. And the idea behind this discussion is that we get a better understanding of why we have some of these grain transportation policies in place today, how we got here, and how things might be improved. You're listening to the Ag Policy Connection, focusing on grain transportation. All right, we are focusing on the changes to the Canadian Transportation Act that were made a few years ago as part of this episode of the Ag Policy Connection. And at this time, we'd like to welcome Scott, Mark, and Greg to the podcast. Thanks for joining us today, gentlemen.
Great to be here.
Thanks for having us, Kelvin. Thanks.
So to begin, I think it would make sense to have each of you kind of share your background, give some context as to what your role was back when C-49 was brought forward. Of course, the issues that we were dealing with in the grain transportation system at that time, and how you were involved in this rail legislation going forward, or kind of what your position was, your view of it. So maybe I'll start with you, Mark, with Quorum Corporation. Fill us in on what your role was as these events unfolded.
Quorum Corporation and myself have been involved in performing the duties of the grain monitor for Western Canada since 2001. Of course, when this legislation came through, we were, again, still as the grain monitor, tracking the movement of grain through all of the different activities that happen in the movement of the grain from the farm gate to the port. At the time, our involvement was limited insofar as the actual legislation was concerned. I think probably it would be fair to say that we provided data and some opinions on the issues at the time when we were asked by the various bureaucrats and people who were involved in developing the policy behind the legislation.
So providing a lot of the data supporting these policy changes. Scott, how about your role at the Canada Transportation Agency?
So I was chair and CEO of the Canadian Transportation Agency at the time that the Transportation Modernization Act was brought forward. As many of the listeners will know, the CTA is largely on the implementation side. It makes regulations and it implements the legislation. But I was, prior to my role at the CTA, I was Assistant Deputy Minister of Policy at Transport Canada. So I was there during a period when some of the ideas that eventually made their way into the legislation were being discussed.
Excellent. Greg, how about your role at Pulse Canada during that time, and the role of Pulse Canada and other shipper organizations?
Yeah, so just background, Pulse Canada represents the growers and exporters, shippers of pulse and special crops. And at that point, I had been with Pulse Canada for about 5 years working on transportation files. And so by the time C49 came, we had, as an organization, we'd worked through the Rail Freight Service Review, we'd worked through the Emerson Report Review. And so, our role when it comes to legislation is really about analyzing it, and then giving our opinion on what should change in it, what shouldn't change. And so it was a fairly busy time looking back in preparation for this podcast. The amount of work that was done just around committee appearances at the House, at Senate, and developing position papers was pretty extensive, not just for Pulse Canada, but with larger coalitions, whether in grain or outside of grain.
Yeah. Well, I think we have a good mix of perspectives here in terms of this policy change and how it was brought about. And Greg, you mentioned the reviews that were undertaken coming out of 2013-14, the grain backlog year that sticks in a lot of people's minds. Maybe speak to a bit of those events that led to C49, the advocacy effort that went into it, and kind of what the environment was that we were dealing with, that government was dealing with at that time, that made this legislation a priority.
Yeah, so 13-14 had brought in some really significant changes. That was a year where there was some real problems moving grain. It was piling up on farm, and just real service issues happening. And legislation was brought in at that time that introduced extended interswitching, introduced mandatory minimum volumes for the movement of grain. And so that was significant legislation at that time. It was around 2015. And then we moved up into a review of the Canadian Transportation Act. That was the David Emerson project, and then government switched, but that continued. And that really led to, I think, the genesis, and I'm sure Scott would be familiar with a lot of it, of the policy genesis that became C49.
Scott, can you speak to that? At what point did some of these policies start to be discussed at Transport Canada or at the CTA?
So I would sort of echo a little bit some of what Greg said, and maybe just elaborate on it. It was in 2013-14 that I was ADM policy at Transport Canada, and of course, as both you and Greg have alluded to, Kelvin, it was a time of some high drama, and we, the government of the day, both the elected officials and the public servants, moved pretty quickly to bring in the Fair Grain for Farmers Act and introduce some of those measures that Greg has referenced. But at the same time, we recognized that act was always intended to be something of an emergency or a stopgap measure. And we set up the Canada Transportation Act review headed by David Emerson, specifically to look at sort of a broader suite of policy options and to think about, for the longer term, what adjustments to the legislative framework might make sense to try to avoid having similar situations emerge in the future.
Yeah. Mark, what do you recall from 2013-14 and that backlog? Certainly you were providing a lot of the numbers, the analytics behind the picture that government and stakeholders in the industry, grain shippers, farm groups were looking at.
Something that's still pretty fresh in my mind. It was something that we started to see early on in the crop year, and it just kept snowballing, literally and figuratively. It was a phenomenally large crop, one of the better ones that we've had in a long time, perhaps setting records. And at the same time, I think the railways had expected a smaller crop, so they were cutting back on some of the resources. And then what followed that was some pretty significantly cold weather. Both railways had line outages in the early period, and from there it just continued to get worse. And that's where banks started to get concerned, because a lot of people's operating lines of credit were becoming due, and this just continued to get worse as we went further into the crop year. And that's, when we got into January, that's when at the time it was Jerry Ritz who was the Minister of Agriculture, and Lisa Raitt was the Minister of Transportation, and they started having meetings with the industry looking for solutions. And the industry, including the railways, met on a regular basis all the way through January and February. It was an interesting time. Basically, what was happening was, as Greg said, grain was literally piling up on the ground in the country. The port, or the country elevator network, was full to the rafters. People just couldn't deliver grain. And because they couldn't deliver grain, they had no cash flow. So it was a critical period of time.
Yeah. I remember Minister Ritz and Minister Rait's press conference that they held. It may have been when they announced that legislation at the Fairmont Hotel in Winnipeg. Greg, were you at that press conference?
No, I wasn't. No,
you weren't. Okay, I'm sure Pulse Canada and the shippers were represented there, though.
For sure. Yeah.
What was, from a shipper's perspective, what were you lobbying for or advocating for in those years when 2013-14 and that backlog were so fresh in our memories? Scott and Mark have both mentioned that legislation that the Conservatives brought forward, but as Scott alluded to, it was meant to be temporary, and there were timelines, expiry dates on some of those measures. What was Pulse Canada and other shippers at the time? What were you looking to the federal government to implement, or what were some of those key policies you wanted to see in this legislation if it was brought forward, Greg?
Yeah, well, there was a whole host of things, and the thinking, I think, the baseline thing was always around competitiveness. The focus on the railways is often the fact that they're dual monopolies essentially, and so how do you drive competitive features into a market like that is often the baseline. And so a lot of the things that we would focus on would be around increased visibility data to try and bring some of that asymmetrical visibility on railway performance, make it more public, more open, so that we would have things to look at. And then a lot of it was around actually the agency, and how do the agency is the regulatory, the regulator, essentially. I mean, Scott mentioned the implementer of a lot of this, the regulator of railways, right? And so were there more things that you could do around competition and the fact that as companies in monopoly positions, like, what should the regulator be doing? And it echoes a lot of the kind of things we're seeing now, telecoms, et cetera, but it's the same idea with the railways. So whether it was around increasing the powers, increasing the types of remedies available to shippers with the agency, really, it was really, ultimately the focus was just around visibility, accountability, and driving competitiveness into the market.
Okay, so moving ahead then to C-49 being announced, what do you recall from that process, Scott, as to what was included in C-49 and the conversations about implementing it?
So C-49, we have, I will just note, we may go back to a couple. We've sort of skipped the intermediate step, which was that we had David Emerson and company make a bunch of recommendations. Yeah.
Well, let's fill us in on that gap. Let's cover that right away.
Okay, sure. So, I mean, listen, there's a raft of recommendations, but I would simply summarize it as follows. After a year and a half of effort, the Canada Transportation Act review, which focused on a lot of issues, not just on the freight rail issues, submitted its report in late 2015. To the new Minister of Transport, then Marc Garneau. And they had a series of recommendations around freight rail, many but not all of which were either partially or fully reflected in the legislation in the Transportation Modernization Act, which was then tabled in 2017. So I'll just go, since you posed the question that way, I'll just go to sort of some of the key measures in the legislation. Probably the three most important that were in the original legislation, because another was added through the parliamentary process. One was an adjustment to the formula for calculating the maximum revenue entitlement in order to give railway companies credit for their individual investments in hopper cars. A second was the creation of a new remedy called long-haul interswitching, which replaced what was called competitive line rates and was intended to create more competitive tension within the railway sector and offer more choice to shippers. And the third, I think, most important change in that original package was around the final offer arbitration of rates between railway companies and shippers, where the amount for one of the summary processes was increased from $750,000 to $2 million. That was a recommendation of the Emerson report. And the period that could be covered by one of these arbitrations was increased from 1 to 2 years. Emerson and Company had recommended 3. The legislation established 2. So those were some of the key changes that were included in the legislation pursuant to the events of 2013-14 and to the recommendations of the CTA review.
Did that fulfill your wish list, Greg, at the time as a grain shipper?
Some of it did, for sure, but there's a few other things that were in there, and as Scott mentioned, one of the big ones that when we saw the full package, and that's that we were really trying to get at, and that I alluded to, was around this idea of the agency having own motion power to investigate the railways, which we can get into because we didn't quite get all the way there. But there was a definition as well provided around definition for basically adequate and suitable service that was brought in as well, which brought in a whole bunch of things that the agency should contemplate when looking at the railways service provisions, which also didn't quite get us there. But there's also the data features, increased data. There's increased collection of waybill data, increased data that was meant to be provided by the railways. Within the grain sector specifically, there was a requirement every year for the railways to publish reports on how they plan to service the sector. So there was a larger suite that were sort of took what we would often talk about and translated into legislation. I wouldn't say that we got to where we wanted to go, but there was definitely elements that reflected some of the things that shippers were saying. Whether it was successful or not, we can probably get into. But
yeah, that's coming up here yet. I did want to touch on some of the, I guess, political stuff that happened in the process of moving it forward. Scott alluded to some of the changes that were made by Parliament or through the legislative process. Greg, we did see this piece of legislation bounce back and forth between the Parliament, or between the House of Commons and Senate, which we don't often see. A bit of the Senate, I guess, exerting itself. What was that process like from your perspective as you were hoping to see this legislation get across the finish line?
Yeah, that was a very interesting process. It's not something that generally the focus on the Senate from the shipper's perspective was very strong, because we were able, I think, to make a pretty compelling case around the things we were asking for. It was around own motion power and some things with FOA, I believe, is what we were some tweaks to the legislation. And so that was really interesting, because it did ultimately bring change to the legislation, and it was not a usual process, at least for me at the time, around how to utilize both basically levels of government to get the kind of changes we were looking for.
Had you been meeting with senators in anticipation of having them potentially make some further modifications to it, or had shippers been holding those types of advocacy meetings?
We did. We were holding pretty frequent meetings with senators when, so the similar changes we were asking for with the House, with parliamentarians, were, once we started to see that there was not a lot of potential there, we really started to focus on the Senate. So we went into high gear there.
Okay.
For sure.
Scott, what did that look like from your perspective at the CTA as you're looking at what you're potentially having to implement or enforce at the agency?
So what's interesting, Kelvin, is that the CTA was actually on the record as favoring the introduction of some sort of own motion power in the freight rail sector. We generally sort of were pretty cautious, we're pretty circumspect about intervening in the policy process, but in a kind of a focused way, where we thought something was pretty compelling, we would in fact provide advice to policymakers and parliamentarians. And this was one where, in my appearance, both before the House and the Senate committees considering the legislation, I indicated on my behalf and on behalf of the agency that we did think it made sense for the agency to have the power to initiate its own investigations into potential rail service issues. To sort of jump to the punchline, where we've sort of alluded to it a few times, but ultimately, the Senate introduced a version of that, and it made it into the final legislation. However, it wasn't an unfettered own motion power. The agency was given the right to initiate these sorts of investigations with the concurrence of the Minister of Transport. So a kind of a safeguard was put into place, if you want to call it that, where an elected official could veto a sort of an attempt by the agency to launch such an investigation. However, it was a major step forward relative to where we were prior to the legislation, which was no such power at all.
Okay, so Bill C-49 goes through Parliament, goes through the Senate, and back to the House of Commons, back to the Senate, and it goes for royal assent. I'm not sure. Did it actually go back to the Senate? I'm not sure on the process there. Greg,
Yep.
You might know. Yeah? Okay. Yep. Back to the Senate twice. Goes for royal assent. I remember an event with the Ag Minister at the time, Lawrence McCauley, I believe it was, just north of Winnipeg, celebrating the passage of Bill C-49. What does your role look like at that point, Scott, in terms of implementing this new piece of legislation and getting these policies in place? What was that process like?
So as the legislation was making its way through Parliament, and we could see the contours of what, the additional responsibilities and powers we were going to be given, we started an internal planning process, right? Even if you don't know exactly what the final legislation is going to look like, you get ready. The item on which we had the most planning to do was long haul interest switching, because it was a completely new remedy with a fairly lengthy list of conditions and requirements for people to bring forward those applications. So we did a lot of work internally, so we'd be ready to receive LHI applications if and when they came in. Many of the other changes required sort of relatively minor adjustments at the agency. Things like providing more public data on the complaints that we received, the nature of those complaints, et cetera. So much of the other work was fairly straightforward. Then when it came to the own motion power, which, was introduced late, really what we had to do there was consider, in a general way, when we might choose to use that new power and how we might proceed. So those were fairly high-level discussions. But once it became clear that authority would be included in the legislation, we did start to reflect internally on what that might look like in practice.
Mark, I'm going to switch to you at this point in terms of how the system was performing as C-49 passed. Before and after, from a data perspective, could you notice anything in terms of how railways were performing and what grain movement was like, or were there too many other variables happening at that time?
Actually, interestingly, and there's lots of opinions as to why, by the time we got to the 16-17 and 17-18 crop years, both railways were performing quite well. A matter of fact, probably the 16-17 crop year is still noted as one of the best performing years for railway service. Their numbers were really good. Their car cycles, for instance, were lower than they'd been ever or since. We were keeping a pretty good level of vessels flowing in and out of the ports. The volumes were really good. So yeah, it was almost as if the railways knew that they were pretty much on notice. So as we went through that period of time, rail performance was good, and we were also very fortunate in the fact that weather was not playing a big factor in that period of time for about 2 years.
Greg, from your perspective, did you notice that performance, or that railways were feeling like they were on notice, as Mark said?
Yeah, for sure. Mark's absolutely right. The performance was quite good, and we both through Mark and the Grain Monitor. There's also the Ag Transport Coalition that directly measures railway performance, and it was the case. And it's not super surprising to see that kind of thing, especially when you're facing sort of a large piece of legislation that is really geared, or at least much parts of it are geared towards you. But yeah, the performance was good at that time.
So would you say Bill C-49 has worked as expected then, Greg?
Well, since the bill was brought in, at least from has it worked as expected? I would say for certain aspects, you could probably say it's a success. Certainly from the investment part from the railways, as far as some of the changes to the MRE, we've seen a lot of investment. The one element from that, particularly from the MRE, was they removed containerized movement from the MRE calculation. And and obviously that's of importance for our sector, particularly because we move a lot of containerized goods. And the way that was really sold to us was that it was going to drive investment into containerized supply chain and really sort of supercharge that supply chain. I think the jury's a bit out on that. Perhaps Mark has a comment on whether we've kind of seen that kind of thing, but we had reservations, and we made that clear as far as the MRE goes. But that was always the response both from government and the railways, in fact, that this is going to free up a tremendous amount of capacity in the containerized side. As far as the other remedies or the other things that were brought in, long haul interswitching, I think, can pretty much be described as a policy failure, and it has had no material effect and is a real problem for us, I would say, because it was always touted as something that would be useful, and it has not been. And I think at the time we knew there was going to be clear problems with it, and as soon as we started to go into the process that Scott described as far as the guidance around it, it became very, very clear that it was just not going to work at all. So that was, and because that was one of the pieces, and they removed extended interswitching, which actually was a real competitive power within the rail sector. That was, I think, when we look back on it as our own organization and many others, that was a real losing extended interswitching, replacing with long haul interswitching was actually a real sort of advocacy failure on our part. So not useful. The data side, we just got the regulations in the past few months that were meant to come from C-49. So that's how many years now? 5 years. We obviously had interim data that was coming in, but that's still, I'd say, a question mark around the usefulness of what's going to come out of that. But it took a long time. On motion power as well, while somewhat of a success, I think at this point, twinned with the definition of adequate and suitable and sort of the agency's position on all of it, that seems like something that will not be useful for us going forward either. So C-49, not a great report card from our perspective, for sure.
Scott, how about from your perspective? I know you weren't in a lobbying position, certainly in terms of implementing it, but has it lived up to what the policy expectations were internally?
I guess what I would say, Kelvin, is I'd start with, at the end of the day, the purpose of all of these measures, or at least some of the purposes, are to create more competitive tension and provide some degree of choice to shippers in order to try to, as much as possible, kind of replicate what a more competitive market would look like, right? So it's intended to, all of these remedies and all of these measures in some way or another are intended to try to, create a situation that looks a little more like a regular market might if there was more competition than there is in the freight rail sector. So I kind of start from that point of departure. I mean, Greg is right. At LHI, there have been no applications for long haul interswitching. So, does that mean that it's completely failed? Well, I don't know whether the possibility of applications, the potential risk of applications may have resulted in, may have helped to balance the bargaining power a little bit between some shippers and railway companies. But certainly the fact that there have been no applications suggests that the level of complexity in the provisions that were in the bill may have been a deterrent. On motion investigations, I launched one in 2019 around congestion and possible rail issues in the Lower Mainland. And that, that was a very intense process because we had a mandatory 90-day timeline to get it done. And we pulled it off and produced a determination that was upheld by the courts. So, that I would say means that the remedy is at least still available, that it's been proven to be possible. But at the end of the day, I think that, the question becomes, is the system producing reasonable velocity and fluidity in terms of the movement of grain and other goods? And are shippers and railway companies able to negotiate fair contracts? And I think to some degree, the jury is still out on that. Certainly in the world of shippers, I think that some of the views that Greg has expressed are shared more generally.
Regarding the own motion authority, the power to investigate performance issues, do you think the definition or the threshold for triggering that has been placed at the right spot? Maybe Greg or Scott, I'm not sure which one of you would want to comment on that.
Scott, do you want to start or do you want me to go?
Sure.
I mean, you lived through that. So, obviously you need a minister's approval before you go to that, which was one of the things I think was put into the legislation to try and balance that to some extent, because certainly, that would reflect more of, I'd say, the railway's opinion on how that thing should be triggered. I mean, we would suggest that that's not necessary, and if you're gonna do it correctly, you need to have that removed. The other thing I think, and Scott maybe can comment, or can definitely comment on this, is that it's one thing to be able to do a no motion investigation, but part of what needs to fuel that is really good access to information on data and what's actually happening. So to do that now, and what we felt during that Vancouver investigation was that, shippers really need to come to the table with a lot of information, a lot of data that sometimes we just don't have. In the grain sector, we do, to sort of fuel an investigation. And so one of the things that I think if you're really going to make that work, and even the agency work as far as their fiduciary duty to regulate the railways, is they need a better data stream. And then one of the things I know we really pushed for during that C49 was that, there's waybill data that's now compelled from the railways, really detailed data that can only be used for long haul interswitching, that the agency, has access to for long haul interswitching and nothing else. And so, our view is that if you're going to really make own motion work, you need to unfetter it from the minister, and you need data. You need data to fuel it, so that the agency can literally do something on their own motion, as far as investigate, as opposed to needing shippers to come to the table. Because one of the reasons we liked the agency having that power is that you weren't necessarily putting the burden on individual shippers, which is often the issue that with all remedies with the agency, where it just creates a really contentious relationship. You have to lawyer up for anything, whether it's a level service complaint, whether it's LHI even, you need to apply, and it creates a situation where you're against the railways. And for a shipper, it doesn't work, because the railways are by magnitudes more powerful than you and have market power. Yeah,
makes sense. Scott, do you have any thoughts to add there?
Yeah, I would say broad strokes, I would agree with Greg. Like, I think that a choice was made to introduce an on-motion power with a degree of ministerial oversight. But, I think there are strong arguments in favor of removing any hint of politicization from a decision of the agency to launch a process. So, I think that it's certainly worth considering whether or not ministerial approval is really a necessary safeguard. And data, for sure, data are critical. I mean, I'm not sure that, that if the agency were able to access the waybill data that are submitted for long haul interswitching purposes, or had access to other data, that it would completely relieve shippers of the need to show up and provide information. But I think it would give the agency more independent access to information to make determinations, and probably result in better, smoother investigations. So I think both of those would mark improvements for sure.
Okay. Mark, from your perspective, in the big picture, has C49 accomplished what policymakers were intending as they brought it forward? Has it lived up to expectations?
I would agree with both Scott and Greg on the issue of the own motion power. I think too, to add to that discussion, I would say that there's got to be better definition on what, and this is it's almost a philosophical discussion, but define what adequate and suitable really means in certain situations. Because right now it's a fairly nebulous concept. And I think we've got to find a way to get more definitive about what that really means. I think that the MRE change was a really, really positive thing for the industry, because it's essentially fixed the problem with an aging government hopper car fleet. And the fleet that we're seeing coming together now is far more efficient. It's certainly reduces the number of bad order cars out there. So that's really been a positive thing, I think. One of the areas that I think everybody was kind of hoping for was this idea that service level agreements would be brought on, and the spirit and the intent of the government in putting that into the legislation kind of got missed, because very quickly the railways came up with ways to almost counter it by making car supply part, definitely in the case of the grain industry, making car supply part of that service agreement. And if you decided that you were going to take it to an arbitrator through the CTA and what's written into the legislation, essentially you were left without a service agreement, and therefore without any kind of definitive car supply, which has really put grain companies in the position of where you've got to sign the agreement, because that's the only way that you're going to get car supply. So, and I don't fault the railways for doing that. I mean, they've got their agenda. Shippers have got their agenda. So essentially what it did was pretty much made the whole service agreement, for the better part, not really effective. So that part, despite the fact that everybody had good intentions, it's not really doing what I think a lot of people had hoped for. I totally agree on the LHI side. It was a nice idea, but it became so complicated that people just don't want to go down that road. And I would cite an example of being, and I've heard this from various shippers, where they think that they might have an opportunity to gain access to a market, say in the United States, where they've got to make a decision. But the timeline that's involved in going through first, trying to get a rate from the railway, they turn around, they give a rate and a service perspective that just won't allow them to gain access to that market. But they know that they can get a better one if they change the way that they were going to route the traffic. Therefore, they have to go through the LHI process. By the time you go through that entire process, you probably lost the opportunity to get into that market. So people just don't bother.
Yeah. Greg, would you agree with what Mark says regarding the level of service agreements and how that has played out without making much of a shift of power towards the shippers?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a couple things. Mark's point on adequate and suitable and the definition, like this bill did bring in a definition. It brought whether it's more clear or not, I think is a good point, but it brought in a series of things that should be considered around adequate and suitable. And that certainly, I'm sure Scott had to, address those or try and define them or understand them, through own motion process or potentially other processes. But I think what we're starting to see, at least with the way the interpretation of those requirements, especially around one of them, which mentions the railways' contingency plans around, what their contingency is around service failure, et cetera. We're starting to see, I think, that definition. At the time, I think there wasn't a lot of talk about it, but that definition, it seems problematic in that it's essentially giving railways, as far as a level of service aspects go, not necessarily a free pass, but this ability to recover, as long as they can show that there's recoverability and that they're going to do it in certain weeks and there's a contingency. And it's really hard to get over that bar as far as level of service or even for own motion, if we're asking for own motion. And so that dynamic that's currently happening from that bill is really problematic, and it impacts, as Mark says, level of service complaints and service level agreements. All these things require a shipper to apply for it, right? And so automatically, as soon as you have to apply, that has certain characteristics that I mentioned. It costs a lot of money. You need lawyers. You need potentially experts to bring them on. It creates opposing arguments between you and the railway. And so if you're a really large shipper, you may be willing to do that, for instance, for final offer arbitration. But anything that we want to bring in that would drive competition or bring in anything that mimics like real market conditions, that requires an application process or some kind of remedy like that, I think now we all have a pretty clear understanding that that's not going to actually be effective, at least in sort of a broad sense. That's why extended interswitching, which was at the time, it didn't require a shipper to have to go to the agency, right? It was just there. And that's why that one in particular, when we look back, that was a pretty useful remedy. The rest of them are always going to be something that will always be challenging to get over the bar on.
So then if we focus on what still needs to be changed or moving ahead, what could potentially be changed, Scott, do you see there being room for making it so that shippers don't have to lawyer up, as Greg says, and go to battle against often their only option for getting their commodity out of their elevators? Do you see a way of balancing that so that maybe the CTA is more of a referee in the middle making the call?
I think, Kelvin, that the answer is a partial yes. What I would say is, first of all, just sort of by way of clarification, both the service level agreement arbitration process and the long haul interswitching process have already firm legislated timelines. So those actually, they both have to be done quickly. Now, that doesn't take away the fact that there's a whole bunch of stuff that a shipper who wants to bring an application for it is going to have to do in the lead up. But in contrast to a complaint about past service, right, a service level complaint that says, we haven't been getting the kind of service we deserve, there, the legislative timelines are kind of more just directional. They don't bind the Canadian Transportation Agency. For long haul interswitching and service level agreements, they do. So once the process is triggered, it's actually going to end fairly quickly. But again, that doesn't completely eliminate the need to get ready and lawyer up and all the rest of it. I think that there are potentially some ways that things can be improved, but I would note that the legislation provides for the agency to provide mediation services now to a shipper and a railway company that want to avail themselves. There's nothing in the law that says that those parties that a shipper has to trigger a formal process. So that's another option. But I think in general, the shippers and railway companies simply haven't turned to the CTA for those kinds of services. They've seen it more as a decision maker than as a facilitator, let's call it. And given that I'm in my post-CTA life, I'm now an independent mediator and arbitrator, I would observe, not really out of self-interest, but just at looking at the market, that's also an option, right? I mean, people don't have to, if shippers and railway companies want to try to iron out their differences and not resort to a kind of a formal, lawyerly, legalistic process before the agency, they can turn to private sector mediators and arbitrators and get resolution that way. And I would actually say that potentially holds more, that holds more promise, because it does tend to be less legalistic than actually accessing a legislated remedy.
Greg, I'll let you respond to that. And also, just to wrap things up here, what would be on your wish list if we could see another round of legislation? I don't know if there's political will for that or priority on that right now, but if you had a wish list as to what could still be improved from a shipper's perspective, what would be on that list?
Yeah, I mean, to Scott's point, the bill did bring in, it brought, and the agency's done quite a good job of this. It directed them to provide more guidance on remedies. There's an informal dispute resolution aspect brought into the bill, like a specific clause around that. And for sure, all that was deemed as quite positive, because the more options you give to a shipper that doesn't have to go into a formal process is good. I think the issue around a lot of that is that shippers and railways are often dealing with things like that within contracts anyways, and like a direct discussions between the railways and shippers. And there's a lot of, I think, doubt from shippers whether the agency, in a sort of mediated process with very little teeth, is actually going to result in anything other than alerting the railway to you having a problem with them, and then them finding a way to somehow punish you down the line. Not to say that will happen all the time, but that is a big worry of shippers. As far as future legislation, we just had this supply chain task force report last summer, or released in the fall. They brought in, or they suggested a lot of things that require legislative change. There's an expectation or a belief potentially that this budget that's going to come out at the end of this month will actually, provide some kind of policy signals around some of the things that were in that report that may require a legislation. So that would open up potentially a new front for legislation. And one of the big things that the industry is really going for is, like we talked about, improvement to the motion power process, as well as bringing back some form of extended interswitching, on top of elements that may or may not be related to data around supply chain task force and these kind of things, and the strengthened agency. But we're actually anticipating that this process that we just talked about with C49 may start up again in the fairly near future, maybe. So we'll see.
All right, interesting. Mark, I'll give you the final word then. From your perspective, when you're talking to all your contacts in the transportation system and collecting data, what do you hear from them as to what needs to be changed, or what you see as potential areas where our grain transportation system could still be improved?
Well, I think, one of the things that we didn't talk about was as it relates to the annual plan that the railways have to put out at the beginning of the crop year. Two things. One is some kind of methodology that's formal, that looks back on a crop year and says, here's what the plan was that the railway put forward. How did they perform against that plan? And what were some of the issues that either said that they made or that they didn't? The other is actually looking at what their capacity offering is, which they're obliged to put into the plan. How does that relate to how the actual volume related to production and carry forward stocks is actually increasing over the years? And what we've seen is that their plan has been very static over the 5 years that they've been putting out these plans, but we're seeing growth continually year over year over year. Last year being the exception because of the drought. But I think that's one area that I've heard from a lot of people in the grain industry that they'd like to see addressed. Again, I think more recently, the issue of the own motion powers have been discussed quite prevalently in the industry, as well as continued pressure on the railways to come up with better plans as to how they can have more surge capacity, the ability to recover from outages, etc. I think our experience last year, although it was a horrendous calamity with the floods that we saw out in BC, and everybody was very, very thankful that both railways came back online after having so much of their line decimated. It took almost 30 weeks after that before actual transportation regularity was actually back into some kind of good form. It was fortunate that we had a drought while this happened, because if it would have been a regular production year, it would have been just awful. I would hate to think about what would have happened if we had a normal crop, for instance.
Yeah, certainly. All of those things make a lot of sense, and we could talk about this for a long time. We might have to do a second episode on grain transportation and the rail system. So, with that, I want to thank all three of you, Mark, Scott, and Greg, for taking the time to join us and share your insight, your expertise, your experience, and thanks for joining us here on the Ag Policy Connection.
Thanks, Kelvin.
Yep, thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much. Thanks, guys. Take care.
Well, as you could hear, a lot of in-the-room experience among our panelists when it comes to this issue of grain transportation and the policy changes legislative changes that have been implemented over the years. Thanks again to Scott Streiner, formerly at the CTA and Transport Canada, Mark Hemis, running the grain monitoring program, and Greg Northey at Pulse Canada. Certainly Greg's been involved in a lot of the advocacy efforts around grain transportation over the last decade and a half or so. So some valuable perspective on the system that we have, the rules that are currently in place, and areas where grain transportation could still be improved. One thing we didn't talk about was issues at the port in Vancouver. That's something that's certainly received some more attention in recent months. The ability to load crops onto ships when it's raining and other logistical issues like that. We could continue this conversation for a long time, and sometimes I wish that we could continue recording after we stop, because sometimes that's when the best stories come out. But maybe we'll invite Mark, Scott, and Greg back for another episode down the road, as there's certainly a lot more we could talk about when it comes to grain transportation policy. Thank you all for your great feedback after our first couple of episodes. I appreciate the comments and suggestions. Topic ideas, always welcome. You can reach me. My email address is khepner@realagriculture.com. You can also find us on Twitter @realagriculture. The Ag Policy Connection is brought to you in partnership, again, between Real Agriculture and the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. So thanks to our friends at CAPI. And thank you for joining us as we try to connect the dots on the big policy issues in Canadian agriculture right here on the Ag Policy Connection.